Wrong of Abortion is an article written by Robert George and Patrick Lee. Robert George is a professor of, I believe, political science at Princeton University, and Patrick Lee is a professor of philosophy at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. As you can probably gather just from the title of the article, they are going to argue that abortion is morally wrong, that it's morally impermissible. um, and while neither of them, while they don't mention in their article anything about the natural law, they are both natural law theorists. And other things that they've written, um, they've kind of argued for a natural law theory of ethics. It's clear that that's where they're coming from. And so I think we can read their article as kind of coming out of the kinds of ideas that you find in Evangelium Vitae, even though they don't explicitly mention the natural law in their article. But it's kind of a piece with the kinds of ideas that you would find in Evangelium Vitae. All right, so let's see what exactly they have to say. Now, the majority of their article is concerned with replying to and discussing pro-choice views. They spend most of their time arguing that certain moves or claims that pro-choice people have made don't work. Before they turn to that, however, there is a section in which they discuss the embryo and the status of the embryo. And so let's turn to that really quick. So they recall some of the features of development of the embryo, right? It starts off as a single-celled organism, and then those cells divide, and then it starts forming a heart and the brain, and so on and so forth, right? They kind of go over these facts about embryonic development, fetal development. They draw out three important points about the embryo. So first, they want to say that the embryo is distinct from either parent. What that means is that the embryo is not a part of either parent. And in the case of the father, right, you might think, well, yeah, that's obvious. But in the case of mother, that might be a little bit, really, what do you mean exactly? Isn't it just part of her, womb or uterus or something is kind of embedded in there? How is it not a part of her body? And I think what George and Lee are getting at, what their idea is here is, well, no, it's not. It might be embedded in her body, but that doesn't mean it's a part of her. Look at the genetic codes of the two things, right? Look at the genetic code of the fetus. Look at the genetic code of the woman. They are different. The embryo is not a part of the woman in the way that her fingernail is, right? Her fingernail, if you look at those cells or whatever, right, you can tell genetically that they're part of the woman. Whereas the embryo has this distinct genetic code. It's not genetically a part of her, right? And so it's not a part from her. It's not a part of her. It's distinct from her. It's distinct from either parent. It has its own unique genetic code. You can think of it that way. So it's distinct. They also claim, important feature of an embryo, it's human. It's clearly not inorganic. It's not a rock, right? It's organic material. And, it's a living thing. It's cells. It's not just like, I don't know. There's organic materials that are it's cells. It's some sort of organism. And it's not an amoeba, right? It's not that. It's not a piece of grass or plant or anything like that. It's not a dog. It's not a chicken. It's a human. It's human, right? It's not chicken. It's human, right? That's their idea. The embryo is human. It's not a rock. It's not inorganic. It's organic. It's not a chicken. It's human. right? So it's distinct from either parent and it's human. And lastly, they claim that the embryo is complete. What this means, somewhat similar to what we were talking about under point one, the embryo is distinct from either parent, but it is different. The embryo is a complete organism in its own right. And we'll talk about this in greater detail as we proceed. It's not like a skin cell or something like that, right? Skin cells are not complete organisms in their own right, whereas the embryo is. And the way that they describe its completeness, the way George and Lee describe the embryo's completeness, is by pointing to the fact that the embryo has its own internally directed growth. If its environment is appropriate and its environment doesn't choke it off and it doesn't whatever, right? If it's in the appropriate environment, it will grow on its own, so to speak, for the direction of its growth being determined internal to it. It will direct its own growth into a full mature adult member of the species. And this is true despite the fact that it's in the woman's uterus, they'd want to say. Because one way of looking at it is that, well, that's just the environment required for an embryo, right? The fact that the environment required for the sustenance and sustaining of an embryo is a woman's body, that doesn't mean that the embryo is incomplete. That's just its environment. And so they would say, in the same way that a 2-year-old is a complete kind of independent organism in its own right, so too is an embryo. A 2-year-old needs a certain environment. You shoot a 2-year-old off into space with no spacesuit or whatever, right? You just throw them up there, right? They're not gonna do too well. They need a certain environment in order to continue growing, in order to continue developing. And that environment's going to include not just atmospheric conditions like air and so on, but they also need someone to provide them with food. You can extend environment to include things like that. Otherwise, they won't develop. Nonetheless, their development is kind of like, it's something that their body themselves, the organism itself does, right? It needs that environment in order to grow, but the growth is directed internally. George and Lee would say the same exact thing about the embryo. Its environment is a little bit different. It doesn't need, the oxygen and then a mom or dad bringing, peanut butter jelly sandwich or whatever. It needs the I should know more about this stuff. It needs the whatever to be embedded in the wall of the uterus and the amniotic fluid and the placenta. There we go. It needs all that stuff, right? That's the environment in which the embryo can grow. Okay. So the embryo is a distinct and complete human being. That's so that's the heading that you see there. That's a way of encompassing those 3 points. Now, to further illustrate what exactly is at issue here and what exactly they're saying, I want to make a few more comparisons. I already kind of started doing this, right? The embryo, it's not like a skin cell. It's not like, right? But I think this is instructive for kind of understanding what George and Lee are saying. So we're going to make another comparison. So, and George and Lee, I think, do this themselves. Oftentimes in the abortion debate, so you have the pro-life people say, from the moment of conception, the things, you can't kill it. It's a human being with rights and so on. It's going to potentially be this and that, and it's going to potentially be a full adult member and so on. And so you can't, right? The pro-life side says something like that. And a kind of common rejoinder, I don't know how common, but common enough, I suppose, is that, well, look, the embryo is no more a human being than, a sperm cell or an ovum. Yeah, sperm, and if you're going to say we need to protect all of these potential human beings, these embryos, well, then don't we need to protect all of the ova and all the sperm and everything? Aren't they kind of morally equivalent? And certainly, the ova and the sperm, the sex cells, those are potentially human beings in the same way that it seems like an embryo. So so this is advances a kind of criticism um, of the pro-life position, perhaps as a kind of reductio ad absurdum, if that phrase means anything to you, right? If you really think potential is important, well, then you're going to have to say that we need to protect every sex cell. I'm reminded of there's a Monty Python song, whatever. If you know it, you know it. But right, that would be the view, and that's absurd. That's crazy. You can't think something like that, and so there's something wrong with the pro-life position. Now, the kinds of things that George and Lee are saying here, I think, offer a response to that line of argumentation against the pro-life view. So let's consider it. Let's compare the embryo to the sex cells. So that right there is an ovum. And I'm telling you that it kind of looks like, I don't know what it looks. I don't really know. I mean, who knows what an ovum looks like? But it looks like that, right? There it is. All right, and there's the sperm cell. Yeah. Now you're ready for it. The miracle of life. Boom. And that makes an embryo. Yeah, we all know how that works. Okay, fine, fair enough. So there's our trusty old embryo there that we've seen in previous videos. Let's bring the other actors back onto the stage, right? Now let's compare all these things. So you put the sperm and the ovum together and you get an embryo, and the kind of pro-choice, if you will, criticism, or the criticism of the pro-life position might be that there's no real legitimate differences between those three things there. They're all potentially, productive members of society and so on, but they're all just like cells. I mean, and cells aren't that important, complete human individuals are, right? And those things are just cells. And so there's no real moral difference between those three things, right? That might be a kind of criticism of a particular kind of pro-choice, pro-life position, right? So what would George and Lee say about that? Starting with the sperm, they would say, look, that thing is not distinct from the father. It is a part of the father. It's genetically identifiable as one of the father's cells. It is a sex cell of the father. And the same thing could be said of the ovum. That's not distinct from the mother. That is genetically identifiable as a particular kind of cell of that particular kind of organism, namely, a human being. Those things are parts. The embryo, by contrast, is not a part of the mother or father. It's distinct from the mother and father. It's distinct from either parent. That's a big and important difference, George and Lee would say, right? The sex cells are not distinct from the parents. They're quite clearly parts of the parents. The embryo, as we had discussed, is distinct from them. Just look at its genetic code. It's not genetically identifiable as part of the mother or father. And if you wanted to say it was, well, then you'd have to say that sons and daughters are parts of their, me. I'm a son, you're a son or a daughter, whatever, that we're all parts of our parents. And that's not true, right? We're just as, so what George and Lee would say is that you and me are just as much parts of our parents as the embryo is a part of its parents, right? That's a big difference. Second, and this is kind of contained in what I've already been saying, the sperm cell is not complete. It is not an independently existing organism with its own internally directed growth. It's not growing into anything. It's not developing or growing into anything. And it's not an independent organism. It is a part of the father. It's a particular kind of cell of an independently existing organism, namely the father. And the same thing could be said of the ovum. It is not an independent organism. It is a part of the mother. It's not complete. It doesn't have its own internal direction of growth. It won't develop into anything on its own, so to speak. The embryo, by contrast, is a complete, distinct human being, right? So all those things up there are human. They're all human cells, yeah. And so the embryo, in contrast to the sperm and ovum, in addition to being human, is distinct from its parents, and it's complete. It has its own internal direction of growth, right? And it's not identifiable as a part of either the father or the father or mother. That's the idea. And so there's a world of difference, George and Lee think, between the sperm and ovum on the one hand and then the embryo on the other. And in the moment of conception would be what kind of divides them, right? That moment is when you get a human organism, right? That's the change from just kind of parts of the parents to an independent human organism. The moment of conception is that dividing line, right? And they think that that's a kind of ontological change. And so it's a good candidate for when there's going to be a moral change. This is going to kind of show up in some of their later arguments, right? That's a fairly radical break. And, as far as it goes, that kind of makes sense, right? That's a very radical break between just cells that are parts of other people and then some new thing, new independent organism, right? That's the point that they're trying to make here. Now, that's basically all that they say. So they make these points about the embryo, and then they move on to considering pro-choice positions and kind of criticizing them, describing where they think they went wrong and so on. There's never actually in the piece a kind of positive argument for their own view. George and Lee, they never give, here's an argument for why abortion is morally impermissible. Boom, boom, boom. They never really actually do that. I think that what's in the background is a kind of unstated argument. And perhaps the reason it goes unstated is because it's so common, right? We've seen this argument in almost everything we've read, or some variation on this argument, right? It's the kind of standard pro-life argument. Singer has it. There's something like it in Thompson. You find something kind of like it in Roe versus Wade. And so perhaps they didn't include it. Perhaps they don't state it because they take it to be just so intuitive or obvious or common or something like that. But for the sake of clarity, for the sake of being thorough, right, here it is. I think this is really kind of where they're coming from. This is why they think abortion is wrong. It's wrong to kill an innocent human being. The embryo is an innocent human being. It's wrong to kill the embryo. Something like that seems to be what they're driving at. That seems to be their argument. And the stuff that they were, the material about the embryo being a distinct and complete human being seems to offer support to premise two there. I think that's how they're thinking about it, right? And so they've kind of, and that's the one that's that's the premise that is really controversial. And so by supporting that premise, they're supporting this argument. That seems to be what's going on. Now, as we proceed, we're going to see how they respond to certain criticisms of that premise, because the way that a lot of pro-choice thinkers think about their position is by contrasting it with the pro-life argument that you see right there. And a lot of them criticize that second premise. We'll see how exactly George and Lee respond to those criticisms as we proceed.